All right, so thank you guys all for coming today. We're going to go ahead and get started. So, my research, Let's Go There, Influencer Marketing in the Travel and Tourism Industry and its effects on consumer behavior, takes a look at the growing presence of social media and influencers in many of our everyday lives and really tries to dig into the way that the presence of these people have impacted our consumer journey and also the way that we make decisions as consumers every single day. So today I'm going to briefly go over some of the existing research in this area before getting into my own research methodology, my results, and ending with my analysis and key takeaways. But before we get started, I wanted to pose you all a couple of questions. If everybody could just quickly click their camera back on, it'll be just like for a second. So my first question is, just by a raise of hands, who here uses Instagram? Okay, now keep your hand raised if you follow somebody that you do not know in real life, such as an influencer. All right, awesome. So that's pretty consistent with what the market research shows, where 61% of social media users report following somebody that they do not know in real life. And this really just highlights the prominence of influencers in the online landscape and how prominent they are for both consumers and marketers. So 72% of major brands have claimed that they plan to allocate major portions of their marketing budgets toward influencer marketing, and over half of Gen Z have claimed that they learn about products or services from social media. And these statistics really just highlight the question that my research is trying to get at of how are these tactics shaping consumer behavior and decisions? So before I get into the existing research, I want to leave you all with one final question to think about. This is a question that I asked each of my interview participants and one that I'd love to open up again for discussion during the Q&A. So, in your mind, what does it mean to be a travel influencer? And while you start to think about that, I will go ahead and get into my research that I conducted last semester. I divided it into these five major buckets. And within those five buckets, the concepts of digital marketing and influencer marketing really served as a framework for the other theories that emerged. So, the rise of digital marketing really came with the shift from a one-way communication model towards a two-way communication model, where consumers and brands are now having these conversations online. And it's really increasing the way that consumers engage with brands online in comparison to more traditional offline methods. And as a result of these shifts, influencers have really become key and essential players in the digital landscape. And influencers are those people that you see online endorsing products or services to their followers, and they are paid to do so. Because we can choose who we follow online, we often are going to select to follow influencers that closely identify with our lifestyle and values. And therefore, we will see them as more candid and real than possibly celebrities that we follow online. So, from the framework of digital marketing and influencers came these six concepts. Starting with the theory of social proof, which was ideated by Robert Cialdini, that just says when consumers don't know what to do, they're going to look towards people that they perceive to be similar to themselves to determine what is right. So, with influencers having such a public online platform, consumers can really start to lean on them and inform their decisions based on what those influencers are doing. Similar to that, consumers are really starting to lean on wishful identification to inform their behaviors. And this theory just refers to the desire to act in the same way as those that we see online and really makes us feel like we can become similar to them. And then outside of theories of influence, I took a look at consumer attitude. And within that realm of things, I just learned that consumers are more likely to develop a positive attitude towards a brand and influencers when there's high congruence between the influencer and the product that they are endorsing. Um, so if they are highly aligned, there is much more likely to be a positive attitude. And when there's no alignment, consumers are going to perceive that product and influencer poorly. When it comes to consumer engagement, I found that consumers are much more likely to engage with posts that are by influencers rather than are sponsored or boosted on their page. And then in terms of consumer trust, this relates a lot back to what I just discussed with consumer attitude and relies heavily on the concept of congruence. So when there's high congruence and low commercial motivations, the consumer starts to see that influencer as more credible and therefore heightens their trust in them and is more easily able to move through that consumer decision-making process onto purchase intentions. So outside of those theories, my research also looked into the question of sponsorship and sponsorship disclosure. So the FTC requires that influencers disclose any partnership of any kind to their influencers. The existing research on this topic was very polarized, with one side arguing that disclosure increases trust in an influencer due to increased transparency, and the other side argued that disclosure starts to trigger persuasion knowledge within people and therefore leads to more negative behaviors. So, with those concepts in mind, I really started to think about the way that social media has become central to our everyday lives and look at the way that it exists within existing literature. So, while I found that literature really covered some of the more popular industries, such as beauty and lifestyle, I found that there was an overall lack of research around travel and tourism. So to add to this conversation, I developed three primary research questions looking at first, how do travel influencers shape the consumer perceptions of travel destinations? Next, in what ways do consumers utilize travel influencer posts to inform their purchase intentions? And finally, how do statements of disclosure shape the consumer perception of travel influencers? So, to answer these questions, I decided to take a qualitative methods approach in the form of in depth interviews. These interviews allowed for me to gain a deep and contextualized understanding of what was really going on for the participants. It gave the participants the opportunity to reflect on their own thoughts and understandings of what was going on and their past experience of interacting with influencers online. So to do so, I conducted 11 semi-structured interviews, all following an interview guide, and each interview lasted between 45 and 60 minutes. To determine who I was going to interview, I set a couple of parameters, beginning with they had to be a member of Generation Z. I selected this age group in particular because they have a large affinity for social media and social media influencers. They're generally known to be a digital generation, and according to eMarketer, they're also the most likely generation to make purchases that are inspired by influencers. Beyond simply having to be a member of Generation Z, I also determined that they had to be following one or more of Influencer Marketing Hub's 22 Instagram travel influencers to follow. So aside from the fact that Influencer Marketing Hub is a very well-known publication in the influencer industry, this list also included influencers from a variety of travel styles and from a variety of locations around the world. So I felt it would be able to give me a more in-depth and curated list to look at than a different source might have provided me. So to analyze my data, I then used a thematic analysis and used the constant comparison method along with that. And using a thematic analysis allowed for major themes to emerge from the raw data rather than trying to frame it in pre-existing research. And the constant comparison method just allowed for me to exist or compare existing findings with findings that were emerging from the data in real time and allowed for me to code and analyze the data simultaneously. So during these interviews, participants were asked to reflect on their use of Instagram, their travel tendencies. They were asked to share their motivations for travel or for following travel influencers and asked to reflect and share stories on the ways in which social media posts have impacted their travel decisions. But on top of those questions, I also showed them some images to really dig into their reactions to things that they might see in feed. So participants were shown these two images, each of which are from an influencer from the Marketing Hub list, and each of which represents a different style of travel influencing. So the post on the right represents a more destination-based tactic, whereas the post on the left represents nation branding tactics. Participants, when shown these images, were asked to share their initial thoughts and feelings upon seeing each image, and then were asked to consider their desire to visit each location and really reflect on why the post led or did not lead to the desire to go there. Following those images, I also showed these two images in a side-by-side presentation to participants to try and uncover their sentiment and reaction to sponsorship disclosure. So similar to the last images, participants were asked which of these posts was more effective in moving them towards consideration of the destination, and reflect on why these posts made them feel differently, given the very small difference between them. So through analysis of my data, seven major themes emerged, beginning with aesthetic and educational value, gateway to further research, seeking authenticity, insider knowledge, empowered to travel, influencer segmentation, and finally, a maintained resistance to advertising. So, to begin with the aesthetic and educational value, it became evident that many participants initially followed, stayed following, and eventually would stop for images on their feed solely for the aesthetic and entertainment value. They enjoyed seeing beautiful things. They enjoyed the curation of the feed that the influencer provided them, and overall just really enjoyed getting to learn about places around the world. However, it also was evident that this aesthetic value served as an entry point to the consumer decision-making process and really drove interest and consideration. So as you can see by this quote from Jack, which I have on screen, he would see something beautiful and then he would save it and add it to a bucket list of places that he would want to go in the future, which really just evidenced the way that beautiful things drives desire and consideration to go there. So, on top of looking for aesthetic value, they also shared that they looked for an educational and informational aspect to the posts. And this educational aspect was there to help them plan their own trips at various points throughout the consumer journey, whether it be deciding where they're going to go, or once they're there, where they're going to eat and what activities they're going to do. This was present throughout the entire process. However, it was noted most significantly at gaining inspiration and curating a consideration set of travel destinations. So participants noted that it was a key component in curating their consideration set because it made it less daunting. So as you can see from what McKenna shared, there are just so many things to do that an influencer post might make it that much easier to select from a smaller pool of things than just Googling 50 things to do. So when looked at together, aesthetic and educational value really start to drive information search and consideration, which leads us right into my next theme of gateway to further research. So while participants reported that they sought information in the posts, oftentimes this was not enough to develop purchase intention and move on through that consumer decision-making process. Rather, it led them to want to conduct their own research, whether that be through YouTube videos, looking things up on Yelp reviews, or even just clicking on the location tag on Instagram to kind of see what else was going on there. Participants overall shared a hesitation to trust the word and recommendation of the influencers alone and wanted other information to back that suggestion up. Beyond that, they also would use these posts as a jumping off point where they could maybe find new places out of the place that was shared in surrounding areas or similar excursions that they could do. So my next theme is seeking authenticity, and this is very closely related to the sentiment that influencer posts might not be representative of a destination. So participants overall shared a dislike for manufactured posts, whether that be through the editing that is done on the post, the way that they feel a post might be staged, or if something just feels completely unrealistic, like they've seen it before in person and it just is not captured that way on Instagram, they really did not have an appreciation for that. When a post was more authentic, they had a lot more trust in the influencer and the destination. However, while they did seek this authenticity in the post and the narrative that the influencer created, they also were able to recognize that these posts are just a moment in time and weren't really capturing the whole story. This was captured really well in the quote that I shared from Henry on screen, where he just talks about you're capturing one thing and nobody knows what's going on behind you. It could be an absolute dump, but participants seemed to feel confident that if the moment was authentic that was shared, it didn't really impact their consideration of the destination. They just wanted authenticity in what they could see. And then beyond seeking authenticity in the influencers, they also shared a desire to seek authenticity in their own experiences that they had at destinations, and they wanted to do less touristy things. So I had participants share that they really preferred to capture more organic moments rather than trying to manufacture this perfect image for their Instagram feed. And then my next theme is insider knowledge. So a lot of times it became evident that the participants didn't gain enough from it just being beautiful. They wanted to do something different. They wanted to experience something different than everybody else is experiencing. Um, and just have that insider special knowledge that maybe everybody else in their network doesn't have. So at one point during my interviews, I asked the participants if they would prefer to go somewhere they'd seen other people go, or if they'd rather go somewhere completely new. And the large majority shared that they would prefer to go somewhere they've seen others travel to, because if they see them having fun, they also want to be part of that fun. But while doing so, they also liked to find their own favorite spots and kind of gain this experience that was different than everybody else. However, a couple participants did share that they would rather go somewhere completely new, never seen before, because they wanted to be able to have that story that nobody else had. And it gave them that sense of being special and having this level of knowledge that not everybody else had. Um, so when they had that inside scoop, it really made a destination more appealing to them, and they were more likely to consider going to that destination. And then, so my next theme is empowered to travel. So seeing somebody, whether it be a friend or an influencer online, really made my participants consider things that they might not have considered or thought possible before, whether that be going to a country they might have never considered or thought was possible to go to, as you can see with Mackenzie sharing about Antarctica, or I had participants share that they went skydiving and bungee jumping because they saw people do it and returned safely. So when they felt that the person sharing online was similar to them, or they had a long term trusting relationship with that person, they were much more empowered to try those things that they wouldn't try otherwise. Another key component that was shared in this way that people online empowered them to travel was the sentiment that influencers are just human. So the things that they're doing were really attainable for anybody to do. And then segmentation of influencers also emerged as an essential aspect for the participants to determining a consideration of a destination. This was evident when I asked my participants to describe the influencers that they followed in 3 words, and one participant immediately responded with female without even a second thought. She never had thought about it before, but she determined that she was following female influencers because the content that they shared was very closely related to what she was looking for and what she wanted to find out of an account. And this theme was prominent in each of the other interviews, as well as participants shared that they were more drawn to an adventurous solo traveler than a couple traveler, or vice versa, just depending on what they personally were looking for in travel. So some other segments that emerged were female travelers, family travelers, budget travelers, those influencers that are just posting bikini pictures at every destination they visit, and other segments of that nature. So when a participant felt more related to a segment, they were more likely to begin considering going to that destination, even if they were able to recognize that posts from other influencers were beautiful. If they didn't feel a sense of relatedness, they really didn't consider going there. And then my final theme, which was a very prominent theme that emerged in this research, is the maintained resistance to advertising. So, overall, in all of my interviews, the participants recognized the importance of sponsored posts for these travel influencers to be able to continue going on those organic trips and sharing their travels with their follower base. But there was still a major dislike for sponsored content and ads. Majority of my participants said that they would just scroll right past. They would ignore, if they saw it was sponsored, they would ignore the post and not really look more into it. And they just really didn't like following accounts that posted a lot of advertising content. For them, this was closely tied to the lack of authenticity, and they felt like if a post was sponsored, the influencer probably didn't even want to be there. That was a question that came up a lot was, oh, I don't know if they would have gone if they weren't sponsored. And they just lacked an overall inherent desire to go. Whereas if the post was not sponsored, they felt that the influencer was sharing because they wanted their followers to have the information, be able to experience that great same thing that they experienced. And really, we're just going out of the fun of going. So, overall, participants were skeptical that posts were not objective when sponsored and that they only shared positive reviews because they were being sponsored. They did, however, share a couple of ways in which they kind of combated this resistance, first being through long term trusting relationships. So, if a participant followed an influencer for a long time, they were more likely to believe that the sponsored post was authentic than if they had just followed somebody or just randomly saw the sponsored post, then they would start to think that that influencer was just doing it for money. Another way they combated this was through that theme of additional research. So, if they were potentially interested in going to one of those destinations that they saw as sponsored content, they would click on the location and look through other posts to kind of compare what they were seeing in the influencer post to what else is tagged to that location. So, how does this fit into the research that already exists in this area and the conversation that people are already having around influencers and the way that they contribute to our decisions? In my research, I found a lot of similarities with the existing research, beginning with the theory of social proof. So, overall, when participants witnessed a positive experience online, it led them to a much greater consideration of that destination or activity. And this was especially prominent when participants had never considered going or doing that activity prior to seeing it online. I also found a lot of similarities with existing research when it came to congruence. However, in this study, rather than just seeking congruence in the sponsored posts, it became evident that participants really needed congruence to occur across the entire account and on those organic trips that influencers were taking as well. They felt like when the organic trips were still aligned with the values and typical trips and brand that the influencer had established on their account, it was much more authentic and again made them feel a lot more positively towards that location and influencer rather than just going on all of these trips that maybe didn't make sense for them to go on. One thing that I found was really important to consider in all of this research was the culture that Instagram has created. So I mentioned a couple of times that participants really wanted authentic, non manufactured, non edited posts. But when you're posting on Instagram, it's almost a like requirement that your post is aesthetic, well lit, empty. You can't have all these people walking around behind you. Otherwise, nobody's going to stop. And this culture has created a very thin margin for these influencers to operate within because, on the one hand, followers don't want their posts to be manufactured, but they also don't want to just see a really ugly post on their feed. And there's no way to get attention if your post isn't beautiful. And when it comes to social relatedness, this was really a key component in driving consideration and engaging consumers and followers with the influencer. So, as I shared, participants were a lot more engaged with those influencers that they felt similar to. And the feeling of social relatedness drove their desire to be similar and drove that sense of wishful identification and really helped to establish the consideration of places. Whereas when there was no social relatedness, they just wrote it off as a pretty picture and moved on. One major difference that I found between my research and the existing research, however, was the development of purchase intentions. So, previous research said that purchase intention was formed by some of the attributes that I just mentioned, whether it be trustworthiness or wishful identification, social relatedness. However, this study suggested that those attributes can only go so far as establishing consideration and had no contribution to the overall purchase intention. While participants benefited from the information that was provided, they really relied on other rich information sources to establish that purchase intention. One important thing to note, however, is the long-term trusting relationship as a mediating factor in this whole process. So these participants were seeking ways to become more connected, whether it be through those YouTube videos or those Instagram stories. And when they were able to establish a long-term trusting relationship, they started to have decreased ad resistance and started to engage more with those sponsored posts, and really could lean on the influencers more than when they did not have that long-term trusting relationship. And then perhaps what is the most significant divergence away from the existing literature is the exaggerated response to advertising. So as I shared, previous research was fairly divided, but it mostly suggested that um, sponsorship disclosure created greater trust and purchase intentions. However, this study revealed an increased sensitivity to the commercial aspect of posts, and the really established the suggestion that the influencer would not have traveled there if they were not paid. And this significantly limits the consideration that followers and participants had of of the consideration of a destination, and creates a very difficult line for marketers and influencers to walk when they are creating these posts. Um, and this just creates a huge need for marketers to recognize the challenges that are established here. All right, and now I'd like to open the floor for any questions.
I think you did a great job tackling a really big piece of the marketing industry, which means that it can be very unwieldy as a topic of study. So the way that you sort of took the themes that emerged from your interviews and made sense of them within the previous literature, but also within the context of the actual real world platforms is important. So I somehow have a lot of questions. Like, I feel like I've asked, you know, in our separate discussions, like, how could I have more? But I'll start with two. I'll be a little selfish and then I'll open up the floor. So my first one is what sort of learnings come out of this? I know this is sort of more academic research, but if we applied it to the practitioner side of things and thought about how the brands that work with these influencers, or the influencers themselves, I don't know, whatever way you want to take it, what learnings did your research sort of give them, or could give them?
Yeah, I don't know why I stopped sharing my screen, because I actually had a slide on this. So I found a couple of ways that I thought that practitioners could apply some of these key takeaways. Obviously, some of these things are kind of difficult things for them to operate within, just because there was such a thin margin that was found in the responses that participants had. So one thing that I found was that the influencer follower relationship was really crucial. So when selecting an influencer, it's really important that practitioners find an influencer that has a strong engagement with their followers and really has established trust with a lot of followers. And it doesn't have to be the biggest influencer ever, as long as there is a strong influencer follower relationship. And I also felt that practitioners could apply this in really understanding that they need to pay added attention to the segments that they are targeting and who they really are trying to get at and the way that they travel. Because if you're selecting an influencer that doesn't have that same travel style or doesn't have those same values when traveling, you're not really going to get your message across to your audience. So if you want somebody to go on this adventurous journey, then you need to pick an influencer that demonstrates that adventurous and like that kind of thing is conveyed in their posts, and those people who are following them want to be adventurous. And I also felt that marketers and communicators and practitioners need to ensure that there's a lot of authenticity and transparency in their posts, because as I mentioned, people don't want to see something manufactured. They want to see something authentic and transparent, but you also have to make sure that you're still having that beautiful picture that people want to see. So by being very transparent in like why you're going, what you're doing there, that could very well serve as an additional help to getting rid of that maintained resistance to advertising and help to lessen the distaste for manufactured. I also thought another interesting thing that marketers could implement was providing their own additional avenues for that research, because in knowing that people are going to leave your post and go look up something else, you can benefit from that by providing them resources that direct them and that you can like gain impressions from. Like you don't have to have them walk away from your content. You can provide them the additional content.
Awesome. I really like the last bit you added there because I feel like that could feel risky for marketers in some ways, but that it actually would really add to the experience and trust level. So my second question is a little bit, I think less fair because you didn't, it's not something that I think you specifically focused on, but, and I know you didn't specifically ask about it in your interviews, but I'm wondering if it came up with participants or if you've just thought about it as a researcher. I'm thinking about your themes of seeking authenticity and this idea of insider knowledge. And it's just kind of making me think about the role of travel, particularly travel influencing, as opposed to, let's say, like beauty and fashion or something else, tech or something like that, in the kind of larger context of like global travel and place branding. And I guess I'm just kind of wondering about the implications of these things. So like, does the influencer industry emphasize like certain parts of the world over others or certain cultures over others? And like, what does that mean? And what effects might that have on consumer behavior and, you know, some of the things that you looked at? I know that's a big question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think hopefully I answer this. Let me know if I don't answer your question directly. I think that while I didn't ask that in my interviews, it kind of became apparent that like people are sharing just certain locations, but my participants at least really did seek places that weren't being shared. They wanted to go to those off the beaten path, hidden gem places that nobody else had experienced before. And they did acknowledge that there was some implications that came along with going to those places that maybe weren't big on tourism. A lot of people said that they liked seeing those places, but also recognized that that led to gentrification and different economic impacts. So I had one participant specifically point out that he was in Germany for 90 days and he tried to take a picture of a shop, and the owner came running out and was like, please delete that, don't post that online, I don't want people to like know about this. And he looked it up because he was confused on why there was such a bad response, and found that a lot of Berlin and Germany has been gentrified due to the tourist aspect of it. So while they do want to go to those places that maybe aren't advertised as much online, they also recognize that it might not be beneficial for that economy. I don't know if that answered your question.
Very much. Yes. Thanks, Natalie. I'll open it up to the rest of our audience.
I can jump in, but I'm not an official reader on this project. Maybe you already answered this, especially with your, how practitioners can apply this, Natalie, but you've just done so much work in this world of social media, like with different organizations, and you're doing it now with the Vatican, right? And so maybe this is a stretch, but I guess I'm wondering if any of this, I don't know, does any of this shape how you then go about doing your work, creating content, or like promoting other brands? I know the brands, like you're not necessarily like an influencer yet, and you're not necessarily like promoting travel, but I just wondered if there was any things that like you learned in this that kind of rubbed off in other areas or for other projects.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, as I was conducting this, I didn't really like think about how it was impacting myself. I was really reflecting on the responses that I had from my participants, and the way that they shared that the conversation that we had started to make them realize like perhaps the commercial aspect of influencers and like what they were seeing. But I also think in a lot of ways that thinking about social media and the way that I interact and like create content for the Vatican has changed. And I think, like, especially when I'm making my post for the Vatican, for example, I really try to represent the brand as authentically as I can
Yeah.
and make sure that it aligns with what they are posting and make sure that it's like very evident that like it aligns with what people want and the brand that the Vatican has established for themselves. I think is like the biggest thing I've seen.
Yeah. Is there a way that people talked about authenticity? Because I thought that was so interesting that everybody's like, I mean, it's not surprising. I've done a little bit of work with young people in social media. And again, this idea of like authenticity comes up over and over
Mhm.
again. But it's just so funny to me because how do we know when something's authentic or not? Obviously, that if you're being paid by someone, that's like a clear, thing, a clear indicator. But did participants say anything about how they determine whether someone's being authentic or not, other than that, like paid sponsorship?
Um, I had one participant, for example, share that she had been somewhere in Europe and she saw it posted online, and that was a completely different representation of like what she had seen in person. But a lot of the times it was just related to like sponsorship and the editing of a post.
Yeah.
I'm going to pull this slide back up because
Yeah.
this is where it really became evident. These are the exact same picture, almost down to a T. It's the same poster, the same caption, same number of likes, same comments.
Yeah.
The only difference is that it says paid partnership. And when they were showed the non sponsored one, they genuinely all felt that it was much more authentic than the sponsored one, even though the only difference was those two words.
I just think it's so interesting because even like I'm not in the area of PR at all, obviously, as you know. But even when I talk to young people about their time on social media, this idea of authenticity comes up so much, and yet in some ways it's funny because that's kind of the purpose of social
Mhm.
media, right? Is to put on a good face and to make things seem more beautiful and attractive and better than they are, and to kind of do away with all the gross, boring stuff. So I don't know. It's just an interesting thing to me that this obviously keeps coming up. And so I wonder if there's other ways that people could communicate authenticity, or if it really just is down to that like paid sponsorship, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's definitely something that would be interesting to look into in like future research is the
Yeah.
way that these sponsorships are playing into people's perceptions and why just that slight change of words can make such a huge shift in people's minds. Um, I had another thought on that, but I just forgot it. Um, hopefully I
No
remember it,
problem.
but
That's great. I'll be quiet.
Natalie, I wanted to say excellent work, and I'm not surprised to see it based on our interactions together. So congratulations to you and Dr. Patwell and your team. Dr. Patwell, thanks for asking me, hey, what the heck do we do with this now question? So that was off my list. And Dr. Way, I was wondering, yeah, how do participants, define authenticity? Because it's such a floating term. So that right along those lines as well. So thank you. Natalie, what I'm wondering, the social media platforms are always looking to reinvent to make headlines. There's always new features and new interactive devices with them. Things like Twitter changing characters, Instagram is always, potentially threatening to take likes away. How would those, and this is anecdotal, but how would those potential operational changes really affect your study, especially in the context of like social proof theory? Instagram takes away the like feature. Does that change anything?
Yeah, I was surprised to hear in my interviews that not a lot of people pointed out the likes. I think it only came up in one of my interviews when looking at these two images. Somebody was like, well, the likes are the same, so I probably would feel the same. Um, so I was very surprised to know that likes didn't really play into this, especially because likes were pretty prominent in the existing research where they felt that if there were more likes or more followers on an account, that influencer was much more trustworthy. I think a big part of how this research would be impacted by those changes is the addition of features. So I did have participants highlight that they liked going on Instagram stories a lot more than they like scrolling through their feed currently, because they like that interactivity and it's just a lot faster rather than the same motion of just scrolling. And I think also with the invention of an addition of like new platforms, that's also kind of serving as a way that this research might be threatened is like TikTok. I have a lot of people saying that they go to TikTok now for recommendations just because of that user experience and the way that it's a video format and feels much more like personal rather than a staged photo.
Great, thank you. Well, inevitably, this will continue to evolve, and that's why we do what we do in communication. Great work, Natalie. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, great. I will stop sharing my screen again. All right, I just want to thank everybody so much for taking the time out of their Friday. I know it's like the middle of the day, so it really means a lot to have such a large support here as I wrap up my thesis. It was a long time coming, so I'm just so grateful for everybody's support in this.
Congrats, Natalie. Great job
Thank you.
being here.
Let me see. I don't know if she knows how to get out.